Okay, today we are going to finish up World War I, specifically looking at things at the home front, as well as the soldiers and fighting itself. So first, we'll look at what I'm going to call the enemy within. One of the things that we talked about, I mentioned just briefly actually on when we were looking at the propaganda posters, was that there was one that said, "Are you 100% American? Prove it by war bonds or liberty bonds." And that was a direct targeted attack at immigrants. There became this increased fear and of immigrants, of people being un-American, and the U.S. responded by a series of actions and laws that they put in place to combat this enemy within, if you will. And part of this fear came from that the fact that a lot of the U.S. had been very staunchly anti-war until we got involved. I mean, it was the whole purpose of the CPI, which was to get people to turn around and support the war effort when they had been up to that point proudly anti-war. And not everyone was easily persuaded by the propaganda posters and CPI's propaganda in other ways. And so you have both fear of Americans that are un-American and Americans that are immigrants that weren't necessarily doing anything un-American, as the U.S. is going to term it, but nonetheless, simply by being an immigrant, this became problems. And sometimes not even a direct immigrant, but rather a child of an immigrant. There became this whole section of what they called hyphenated Americans. So that would be like German American, Italian American, so on and so on, right? That they identified with the specific cultural group and country from which their families had immigrated from. And again, that didn't have to be initial immigrants, first generation immigrants. This could be second generation kids that just their parents or grandparents, but because they had that connection to somewhere in Europe, that it became to be looked on that they were a potential enemy or threat to the U.S., to the success of the U.S., that they were going to, and we do this in World War II as well, that they were a threat, that they were potentially going to spy on the U.S. and give information to the enemy. We'll see this with the Japanese Americans when we talk about World War II. But it was more widespread, although it is going to eventually target down into German Americans. And there definitely was a higher fear base with World War I than World War II, which is interesting considering World War II we were actually attacked on American soil, and World War I we were not. And yet that fear was very pervasive. So what the U.S. government did is that they called on patriots, as they called them, to report on neighbors. So, and we'll see this with the Cold War too. We repeat ourselves a lot in U.S. history here. We do it, we forget about it, and then we do it again. So you report on your neighbors and co-workers, anyone who was, as in their words, subverting the war effort. Now, this was meant for anyone, but they especially target it towards white Americans, spy and report on your non-white Americans, neighbors and or co-workers. Although there were plenty of white Americans that got caught up in this as well, there definitely was a targeted attempt on immigrants, which was the initial fear for sure. From this, you have thousands of immigrants that were arrested on subversion. in terms of subverting the war effort, looking to undermine the U.S. in whatever way. They created, the U.S. government created the Trading with the Enemy Act. So again, that fear of spying, that they had this concern that somehow all of these immigrants were planning on sending information. And so with the Trading with the Enemy Act, foreign publications of like newspapers, magazines, so on and so on, had to go through the post office. Now remember, the post office, and we mentioned this in a previous class, the post office was able to censor stuff. They were like the censoring board back then, and so they would approve or deny material. So censor material or approve, right? But they were mostly there for censoring it rather than approving it. You also had an attack on German names. Now, not with people, although people who had German names were definitely targeted. But this was the idea of changing street names, changing food. For example, the hamburger went from hamburger to Liberty Burger. We tried to do that with fries, not in our more recent history. It wasn't taken quite as seriously as the hamburger to Liberty Burger. You also had literature and music, all which was either changing the name or boycotting. So some was to simply get rid of, change the name, like I said, from hamburger to Liberty Burger, or they changed a lot of street names around this time, and renamed them. And then certain like German composers and music and authors, they just outright said not an official ban, but like self-ban on those type of things. The other thing that took place was propaganda against Germans in the newspaper. Now, this was more with Germany, but it had a negative impact on German Americans because of the stories that were getting told. It definitely made the Germans seen, and we saw this with the propaganda posters as well, as non-human, as horrible. An example of this was that there was a story that Germany was taking their dead soldiers, right, not enemies, and boiling them into soap. And it was this super elaborate, detailed thing in a reputable, supposedly, newspaper that went into how, like, this is how horrible the Germans are. They don't respect their dead. They're taking their dead soldiers and they're boiling them down. And here's how the process works. And they went through this step-by-step detail of how the process worked to use dead bodies and their body fat to create soap, which then they redistributed to the people. So, the people are using, washing themselves with the dead soldiers' remains, essentially. And this stuff was believed. And that, of course, creates this negative reaction to especially German Americans at home. Then there was a whole push with the school system to essentially what they wanted to do was unhyphenate Americans. Right? So you had hyphenated Americans, the immigrants or first, second generation. So the goal of the school systems was to eliminate that and create and educate with a sense of Americanization, right? We're going to make everyone American. And so that was an emphasis on being patriotic. It was, and there was several things with this, so let's put it under there. So you had no foreign language classes, or at least no foreign language classes with those that were the enemy, right? You're not going to teach those that were we were fighting. An emphasis on American culture, an emphasis on dress, and then of course the English language spoken in the schools by more recent immigrants. The thing that this does, and the idea is that all of this would showcase how you are loyal to America. And immigrants found themselves having to prove over and over again that they were loyal to America. And, often there was no win situation in this, even if you were. And it also created, all of this created a loss of culture within communities, because parents began to be afraid to teach their children the language, right? So the parents only spoke English at home, or at least told their children to only speak English, and didn't teach them their language. But it went farther than language, right? It also went to other cultural practices and food and identity. All of this stuff ended up kind of being eradicated out of fear because of the Trading with the Enemy Act and that whole anti-immigrant sentiment that even led to arrest under the idea of subversion. And so you had a kind of a whole generation that ended up growing up not learning about their culture because their parents were too afraid to teach them any of that, for fear that they would also be targeted as they grew up if they knew the language, if they ate the type of food they were used to that wasn't considered American. And then it gets reinforced by these propaganda posters saying, are you 100% American? Prove it. Notwithstanding the fear of neighbors reporting you just because you seemed foreign, but had done nothing. And there were plenty of people who were arrested who did nothing. Most did nothing. There wasn't really, people weren't actively spying, just like they weren't in World War II, at least not Japanese Americans in World War II were not the ones spying for Japan. But that sense of fear really integrated into every aspect of life. Teachers were arrested because they refused to pledge their loyalty, or they talked out against it. And this got worse outside of just immigrants, which was bad enough as it was within that culture, through a series of acts. You had the Espionage Act that got put into place in 1917. And the Espionage Act was, no spying, right? Which in itself is understandable, but it went further than that. You were not allowed to do anything that was perceived to interfere with the draft, as Americans began to be drafted for the war. Anything that, as they called it, might be perceived, so not even actual, but might be perceived to affect military success, right? So this was super generic and general and vague, And there were plenty of people who were arrested in that for really ridiculous things because it was vague in that. And then you had the postmaster, again with the post office being this kind of linchpin for that could ban newspapers, and not surprisingly foreign language newspapers, and any kind of perceived as immigrant newspaper that was in a different language was banned through the mail. This was also, of course, magazines, pamphlets, and stuff. So they were doing that already, but this was added specifically in the Espionage Act and said that anything that was critical of the war or administration, right? So this is getting onto the idea, and it gets worse with limiting free speech. But so they said anything that could be seen as critical of the war or the administration was banned, was censored by the post office. And this seriously was limiting rights of Americans. Then from the Espionage Act, you go to the Sedition Act of 1918. So they decided, you know what, this is just not enough. The Espionage Act doesn't ban enough rights. We're going to just keep going. So then they made it a crime to speak or write against the government, which of course goes against the Bill of Rights. Makes it a crime to speak or write against the government or the war effort. So in the Espionage Act, it was the postmaster who had the right to censor and ban stuff. Then they take it a step further with the Sedition Act and say, you know what, forget the whole censoring stuff. We need to punish these people. We're going to make it a crime now for free speech because, you can't talk bad about the government. This is a serious thing. And in many ways, there were people who stood up to this and went to jail protesting against this. It often was not fought against as much as it should have been, in part because there was this fear that had been generated that it was this. What happens with all of this is, let's put it over here with why this and the immigrant stuff is going on, is that it really was this: either you are with us or against us. This period. There was no middle ground. You could not say, you know what, I support the United States, I want us to win, but I think war is bad, and I don't think we should be fighting a war. That if you said anti-war stuff, you were against us. It was black and white in that term. There was no middle or gray area whatsoever. And so because that was the sentiment at the time, and also then this fear that all of this generated with these, you have, again, we're going to see, there were people who did speak up and criticized and said, this is wrong, this is not what we should be doing, this violates our rights. But there wasn't citywide, nationwide protest of this, because you don't quite get that spirit of protest against war until later. Obviously, we saw protests with the unions and workers and things like that. But when it came to war, the government had been really good at creating this sense of, what we looked at was nationalism and the pride of that, and going against that then meant you were, un-American. And that can be seen as dangerous and scary for people. You did get jail time for, you were arrested and put in jail for this. Basically, any public statement against the war could and often did go under the Sedition Act. So it really was this unconstitutional thing. Again, it was the belief that you could not be American or patriotic if you were against the war. So there, an example of going against this, you have Eugene Debs, who was charged with the Espionage Act, and was convicted. So he didn't just get arrested and charged, he actually was convicted because he had continued to give anti-war speeches, and he ended up in jail for 4 years for speaking out against the war. Right. So again, there's hundreds and hundreds of examples of this. And he was just one of the most well known because of his speech and what he said going in court. But it shows you, like I said, that there were serious consequences for challenging this system. You also had at this time, we already talked about nationalism, but you had coercive nationalism at this point, or this idea, right? Forced nationalism. Coercive works too, but forced nationalism. Nationalism, as I mentioned, is not inherently bad. When it starts being forced on you, you should, it's bad. And if it ever happens now, you should immediately, that should be a red flag for you. Forced nationalism often leads to worse things. Not only with what we see here, limiting and ending of certain rights, changes in the type of government that becomes a dictatorship or fascist. It doesn't always have to. Here we'll see it doesn't change the government here. But there were a lot of people who were arrested and jailed and had their lives ruined because of this forced nationalism and these laws that got put into place. And it goes against the foundation and standards of what the United States government was set upon. I mean, the whole point of the Declaration of Independence was to remove themselves from what they saw as an abusive tyrant, a despot. And it says straight in the Declaration of Independence that people have an obligation, that the government has an obligation to protect people's rights. And if they fail to do so, then the people have an obligation to overthrow that government and replace it with something that will. Forced nationalism often treads into that region that the founding fathers would have seen as so abhorrent. And it, again, can, if unchecked, eventually lead to worse things. It's not a guarantee, but it should always bring up a red flag. If there's anything, it's one thing to say, like, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance, or standing up for the national anthem, or flying an American flag, and encouraging people to do this. But if those things start being forced, it's a problem. Because that's the whole right of the freedoms that we have, is that we should not be forced to do that. But here, and part of because of fear, and because it was so much this idea of American versus non-American, and non-American, un-American, hyphenated Americans, that were potentially undermining the success of the United States, that the enemy of the state, right, that it led to this situation. So with forced nationalism, it really was, there was anything against the U.S., or, as we saw, the government, the current administration. So whether that was a protests of war, whether that was dissent in how we were going about it. One woman was arrested because she criticized that wars were bad because they killed husbands and sons. That's it. She didn't even say, I think the U.S. should not be, or is bad. No. Just in general, I am against war because war kills husbands and sons. And that got her arrested. So it got pretty, anything you said, discussions that were made public, questioning the government even, questioning government action, all of these things became unacceptable. Anti-war, any anti-war sentiment of any kind, which, again, the fact that questioning that is super dangerous. Again, we're lucky it didn't lead to something worse. It was bad enough as it was. But if a government ever starts arresting you or making laws that makes it illegal to question, that is super, super dangerous and not American. And that one of the great speeches during this time was a congresswoman who said, this whole thing, and we'll see this again actually at the Red Scare. Again, U.S. repeats itself. This whole thing or as a congresswoman with the Red Scare, as a congressman in the World War I. This whole thing with questioning or saying we can't question these people that are arguing the loudest about un-American people are in fact the ones themselves being un-American. Congressman in World War I. It was a congresswoman in during the Cold War with the Red Scare. You also had forced nationalism in the sense of the American flag. And forced nationalism can be forced in the idea of it doesn't, where someone doesn't physically put it on you, but it can be by fear, right? So this can be by laws or fear, right? That people are a fear of reprisal, and so they have to do it. So that the idea of flying the flag then was a symbol of your patriotism. And people who didn't have the flag flying were questioned. Are you showing your support? Are you really American? Do you not support the war? Why don't you have a flag? And this was even worse, right? For, all of this was worse for immigrants. They were immediately questioned and suspected if they didn't show this type of support. So you had, and then again, so it's why that propaganda poster was so bad, because it was directly targeting all this fear and threat. It was a threat. That propaganda poster was a threat. You buy war bonds so you can prove you're American, and if you aren't, you must not be 100% American. Well, if you're a white American, you could brush that off easier. If you're not white and or an immigrant, then you can't brush that off as easily. So that's what, like I said, that one is probably the craziest one to me. The other ones, they do all this different propaganda, and some of them are kind of funny. But that one was a direct threat, especially within this situation. They were strongly encouraged to fly the American, and this came out as a statement from the government that you were strongly encouraged to fly the flag in show of support, which really meant, if you're American, you will fly this flag, or you must not really be American. People were arrested, not for not flying it, but for statements that were critical of the flag. Right, so while they technically weren't arresting people for not flying the American flag, people were arrested for making anti-flag statements, which I'm not sure, I guess it'd be like, I think it's stupid that we have to fly the American flag, or why, or even probably questioning, why do we have to fly the American flag? Those were all kind of big no-nos in that sense. All right, so let's look at the military and war front. We talked about the war front some already, and with the actual fighting of the trench warfare and that stuff. So we're looking more at the logistics here, not how the trench warfare functioned. So with the advent of the start of the war, a little delay there, we only had 200,000 active men in the army. So that was a small number, especially for what our military becomes. And this created a sense of concern, of course, with, whether we were going to have enough people. It was a volunteer army. And so, not surprisingly, you end up with the Selective Service Act, which is the draft, in order to recruit by requirement more men. In 1917, you had not how many, but the age, specify that there. It wouldn't be very many if there were only 25 people, 25 to 35 people. Nonetheless, the age of between 25 to 35 years old, you were drafted into the war. By 1918, they had upped that, and lowered it too, from 18 to 45 years old. And it was a significant increase of desperately trying to get enough men. So this was the draft. You could not buy your way out of the draft. Now, why this is important is that you used to be able to. This was the first war where that was not possible. For example, in the Civil War, you could pay $300 to get out of it, or you could actually also pay someone else to go in your place. So wealthy people had been used to being able to circumvent fighting in war. And this wasn't just a United States thing. Other countries have done this throughout the ages. Wealthy people tended to be able to subvert fighting, or only fighting in high-ranking positions, which were inherently less dangerous. This, though, World War I was the first war where it was somewhat equalized, in that everyone was, all men from ages first 25 to 35 and then 18 to 45 were put into the draft. And you didn't matter how wealthy you were, if your name was called, you had to go to war. So in that sense, you did have that one change that was an equalizer. Of course, where it was not an equalizer was with African Americans, and we'll see this with World War II as well. You still have the South, remember, is Jim Crow era and segregated South. So it was segregated units. And even in the North, where there weren't segregated laws, there was a lot of segregation that still went on informally. And so for the federal government, they created segregated units. Those who did serve were almost always given menial jobs. That were low skill level, and the significance of this is not only, of course, the type of jobs that were not well desired, but as far as having skills and opportunities after the war, then were not only limited because of being Black, but also that you didn't come out with kind of higher level skills that during this time could be pretty beneficial for people after the war. They didn't have, there were very few combat positions. In fact, one of the things that did happen during this time is that many men went to France before we fully got in to fly. So that because they wanted to fight, they wanted to have a position, and you weren't going to get it in the United States Army. You also have a lot of racism and violence that took place. Not always in the actual like unit or military, but in places that they were stationed at. So in Texas, in 1917, you had violent attacks and racial abuse that took place. That was not. It was pretty bad. And then you also had blood was segregated as well. So they only gave white blood to white people, black blood to black people, based on racism. But this idea that somehow the blood was different. Black nurses, which were women, African American women who were nurses, were only allowed to help other black soldiers. So everything about the situation was segregated, and of course it didn't come out of it any improvement after the war. We'll see significant change after World War II, which then leads to the Civil Rights Movement, in part because of World War II, along with other things that are going on. You don't see that here. And then we have, so that, we already talked about the war, like the structure, right? These are just some of the logistics with it. With, of course, the U.S., getting involved, it is a significant turning point because we were fresh. You have thousands and thousands of soldiers coming over that haven't been fighting for years and having, millions of people die. And then you have this sense of the war kind of becomes a war of attrition. And it's one that with the U.S. involved, the Allies have the ability to win. This eventually leads to the end of the war, with Germany looking to not full surrender, but create, have a treaty and end the war. Wilson wanted, you have Wilson's 14 points. Wilson was looking for something that was not the Treaty of Versailles. We'll say less punitive. It was not accepted because France especially wanted revenge. They wanted justice, as they saw it. So in past wars, you fought a war, and whoever the victor was tended to get spoils of war. Right? So the old structure of war, and this was something that was relatively still connected to warfare at this time. So, right, if you're looking at it from today, it's definitely much further, although there are still countries out there that fight to gain territory. But if you're looking at like kind of the Western world and structure, that's not the main structure for fighting, at least not so directly. You can do it indirectly through influence and spheres of influence and things like that. So it's not like it has gone completely. But there was a very direct, like, I conquer you, I get your land. You conquer me, you get my land. And that's a spoil of war. So at least if we're fighting and we win from an attack, there's something gained from it. But there had been moving towards this idea of again, remember we talked about the balance of power and not wanting to have that shift. And also just the idea that warfare was no longer about territory in terms of territorial, let's say, gain. Not grain. Territorial grain, right? No, territorial gain. So the Treaty of Versailles was meant to be, this is what the great powers agreed on. So they rejected Wilson's 14 points, which were more mild conditions and less punitive against Germany, which he warned about. And we'll see the Treaty of Versailles has a direct connection to the problems Germany ends up with that lead to Hitler taking power. And we do learn from this, because we'll see when we look at the end of World War II, the treaty that comes out of that is not like the Treaty of Versailles here, because they're like, yeah, we don't want to create that situation again. So the Treaty of Versailles is incredibly important because it completely demolishes and demoralizes Germany and creates them such a punitive situation that they end up turning to Hitler as their option. And we'll when we get to World War II, we'll see there's several other things going into it, but the Treaty of Versailles was one of those central key aspects of it. So what happened is that the France and the Allies wanted punitive things against Germany. They were pissed, understandably. France was physically destroyed because of World War I in many areas. The landscape looked desolate and charred and permanently restructured areas of France, where had once been farmland or cities. Millions of their citizens had died because of the trench warfare and how long they'd been in war, where France was kind of the central fighting staging ground for war. And since you couldn't get land out of the deal, they wanted Germany to pay in other ways. And so the Treaty of Versailles and the points of it were meant to do exactly that, to make Germany pay for that. So there was the territory that they got back was France got back their territory that Germany had taken. Right, so that's not new territory. All of their territory that Germany had gained in the war, right, was returned. Then they prevented no German fortifications, military fortifications in the Rhineland, because there was understandable fear that France wanted a buffer zone. They were like, we're butted up to Germany, and we want some kind of safety net, so that if Germany decides, hey, we're going to attack again, that there's a little bit more space for us to, I guess, be able to prepare and defend before it comes into France itself. So you had these ones I'm putting here: no German fortifications in the Rhineland, the Allied occupation for 15 years, and then demilitarization of the region. These were all meant to be a buffer zone to France. This was France saying, we need assurances that we're going to have some protection if Germany tries this again. We'll say virtually all of the German military was disbanded. They were only allowed to have a few 100,000 volunteers max, and it was more like 100,000 volunteers. So virtually all German military disbanded, only small volunteer force, with the promise that the Allies would step in if they were attacked. They abolished the German General Staff. This was for like the military leaders. Now, these are all important, but these next ones here are especially so, although I guess I could have put 5 is too. So the ones that really hurt Germany, these all did. I mean, it was like taking away land, saying we're going to be occupying part of your territory. You don't get to have a military. Then they made him have the war guilt clause. The war guilt clause said that Germany had to take all responsibility for the war. Which, you know, if you remember how it started, Germany didn't start the war, but they had to take all responsibility. Germany had to apologize, and they had to take on all the guilt of the war. And this was demoralizing. And I mean, it really created this negative undertone of people feeling like they couldn't be proud to be German. And so when someone comes after the Depression, plus the Treaty of Versailles, and offers to bring back that pride, that sense of power, and you know, like, we can be proud to be German. We're going to be a great nation again. We're going to be a wealthy nation again. People liked it. They were drawn to it. And he gave them someone else to blame, right? Because the war guilt clause had been put on them. Stop blaming yourself. Look to this group of people instead. They also, the next one that was incredibly important was that they had to pay huge reparations. In fact, they were responsible for all the cost of war, which is stupid, by the way. not just for the Germans, right? They're saying you're responsible for paying your own. No. All the cost incurred in the war, you're going to pay. No one can do that. That's never going to happen. This is going to then be problematic. We'll look at how this becomes super problematic and puts them into a worse depression than the Great Depression. And then lastly, they were banned from the League of Nations, which was created at this time. And the reason that this was significant is, of course, because it said that you are not worthy of being part of the ruling leaders of the world to talk about important affairs of the world. We're going to completely shun you. And they were completely shunned from all of this. And so these, along with, we'll say 5, because there was a whole sentiment of the Nazi Party wore military uniform and touted up that military thing. These 4 were super important. The other ones were important too, just adds on to it. But these last 4 really structured the scene and set up the scene for a series of events that lead to Hitler coming to power in the future. And it does become a lesson in what not to do at the end of war. Is that, it should have been anyways, like, you can't make one nation pay, you know, an unattainable sum for everyone for war, nor should you put the blame on only one group most of the time. Not saying that there aren't wars where that's exactly what it was, but this was not it. And the Germans were not the ones that were the main aggressors initially, that they became the main war front, but they weren't the ones that started the war. So all of this, like I said, it becomes, this leads to circumstances that set the stage for Hitler. And as I mentioned, it was used later after World War II on what not to do in terms of treaties. All right, so that's it for what we're going to look at for World War I. The next lecture then is going to look at the end when the war is over, and we move into the 1920s, how that was impacted because of the war, because we were a lender nation. We lent a lot of money, supplies, and other goods to our allies, and that gets paid back. So World War I, and we'll see World War II, create booms after the war. That's not how wars have worked for us since then, since World War II. But these 2 wars, World War I and World War II, when the war is over, the U.S. hits a massive economic and prosperity boom because of the situation that it's in, which then creates the 1920s in this case that we're going to be looking at. And it has a lot of massive change for culture, technology, women during this period that we're going to look at all of those things.